Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We work with not-for-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop campaign strategies, train engagement staff in leadership and power building, and help you execute a campaign with data-driven tactics and actions. And in 2022, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories to inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also proudly brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you highly organised and love working in a fast-paced environment? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an executive legal assistant to support a national leader on a 12-month fixed-term contract based in Melbourne. This will include coordinating and supporting the leader with high-level administrative assistance, coordinating documents with strong attention to detail, building and managing relationships with both key internal and external stakeholders, and providing excellent client service. To apply for this role, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast. I forgot what type of podcast it was. Out every Friday, and we dive into the campaign issues of the day from the people leading them from home and abroad. Today, we continue with our federal election post-election recap review, where we're doing it state by state. And today we're going to look at my home state, the great state of Victoria, the Massachusetts of Australian politics. And to help me unpack it is Ryan Batchelor from the McKell Institute. Ryan will come on the show today and we'll have a bit of a yarn about the results in Victoria and what it all means going forward. Also with the state election coming up in November, everyone and their dog is doing hot takes on the implications this will have for the Andrews Labor government. So we'll have a bit of a chat with Ryan about what he thinks this means for Labor's chances at the November state poll. So check out today's episode, and also don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. And for all the latest updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and as part of our multi-podcast series of breakdowns of all the states' election outcomes, we're now going to look at Victoria. And to join me in breaking down the state of Victoria is the Victorian Executive Director for the McKell Institute, Ryan Batchelor. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Great to be with you, Stephen.
Our home state, it was a great night on election night. Obviously, you joined us from on our live telecast initially from CHQ, but then the last time we saw you, you were actually at the Albanese party. How was
Canterbury Helston Park RSL. It was a pretty happy group of people down there who were very excited. I think I spoke to you before Anthony spoke. The room was pretty electric, and I think there are a lot of loyal Labor people who spent a long time campaigning for Anthony in particular, but for Labor, and they were pretty excited to see him walk onto stage to claim the prime ministership. That by that point Labor had clearly won. We'd won the election, and there was a lot of celebration that night.
It looked fantastic. The pictures were great. And, unfortunately, I guess for us, those evenings can be all too few for the National Party. And I sort of think back to 2007 was the last time I kind of sort of felt a sense of jubilation and celebration. Because 2010 was kind of a weird night, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So it was great for the party faithful to experience that again.
Yeah, it was good. There were some people, in particular, some people we worked with on the campaign, slightly younger than you and I, and living in New South Wales, who'd never in fact voted for a Labor government because of what had happened since, from 2010 really, after the 2010 election, string of losses in New South Wales, string of losses nationally. There's a lot of very happy people who've finally managed to vote for a Labor government, and it was good to see them celebrating.
I can't help but think about politics from a sporting lens as well. Like everyone needs a championship every now and then, like
You do.
because it just fuels the soul. And we've come a bit blessed here in Victoria, certainly with our state Labor governments, but nationally it's been a while between drinks, so it was great to.
I think it shows that it's worth it. That all the hard times, going through the devastating losses, you can rebuild, and the hard work that happens between elections is very important to that savouring of the victory on election night. It's the committee meetings you go to, it's the door knocking you do, it's all of the hard work that goes in between polling days that leads to results like we had on the 21st. And so, when people get despondent after the disappointments of 2013 or the, agonising defeat in 2016 and then the devastating loss in 2019, turns out that 3 years later you can bring it all back if people remain focused and disciplined. The party had a clear strategy, the leadership had a clear strategy about how they wanted to win this election. They stuck to it. We didn't descend into the kind of shenanigans that have bedevilled Labor, particularly federal Labor, in the past, and we got there. And it's a great opportunity now to implement a good policy platform that's going to make lives better for a lot of Australians.
And that's the important thing, isn't it? It's actually, that's where my sporting analogy dies, because your favourite players then go and get drunk on Mad Monday and celebrate. Well, we all go back to work. But when you win governments, actually, you then have the responsibility of impacting people's lives for the better. And that's...
And it was a pretty impressive start to this government, I've got to say. Like, anyone thinking that the election was only, a little over 2 weeks ago, just how fast the Prime Minister Albanese, got himself sworn in, went off, met international leaders, dealing with, Jim Chalmers, Katy Gallagher, dealing with critical economic challenges right here. You've got Penny Wong sort of in 2 weeks making up for a lot of lost ground in the Pacific. It shows you what good, capable ministers can achieve in not very long.
Maybe we'll talk a bit about that towards the end, but let's jump into the state of Victoria and how things transpired on election night. And just to give the folks at home a bit of an overview before we start to dive into some of the analysis, the statewide two-party preferred for Victoria saw a 1.2% swing to the Labor Party, and so Labor is now on a 54.3% 2PP, whereas the Tories are on 45.7%. And then we take a look across the primary results and the seats won and the seats changed. Starting with the Coalition, they had a terrible night. They had a swing of 5.3% against them on their primary. They lost 4 seats. That takes them now down to 11 seats in the state of Victoria, and I think there's 30-odd seats across the state. Labor had a 4% swing against them on their primary. Our primary's at 32.8%. We picked up 2 seats in that process and are now at 24 seats in Victoria, which I think is a high watermark. I can't recall if we've ever had as many MPs been sent.
I don't think we have, no.
No, that's amazing. The Greens had a 1.7% swing to them. They held their only seat, which is the seat of Melbourne, and their vote share was 13%. United Palmer had a 1.1% swing. That took them up to 4.7. One Nation had a 2.8% swing. That brought them up to 3.8. And the others, which obviously includes these teal seats, had a 3.7% swing to them on primary. They picked up 2 seats. That brings the others to 3. Obviously, the seat of Indi is an independent, and their total vote share of primaries was 11.8, almost 12%. Just unpacking those broader numbers, Ryan, what's your bigger sort of takeaways from that shit night for the Liberal Party and a great night for Labor, even though we had a swing against us on our primary?
Yeah, I mean, I think it showcases just how important Victoria is to the Labor Party federally. I mean, we are bringing in seat percentage to the percentage of seats that Labor holds in Victoria now is at 62% of the seats, the 39 seats, as you say. We've got 24 of them. But worryingly, and that's the highest percentage of any state. Obviously, we exclude the territories where it's wall-to-wall Labor in the ACT and the NT at a lower house level. So Victoria is really important, and a very important part of the national scene for Labor on the floor of the House of Representatives. I think importantly, though, it's pretty dire for the Liberal Party. So it's not just that we've got 24 out of 39. But as you say, the Liberals and Nationals combined have only got 11 out of 30. Less than a third of the seats in Victoria, the federal seats in Victoria, are now held by the Conservatives. And that poses a lot of problems when they try and form government again if they're only holding less than a third of the seats in the second largest state in the nation. So I think very good result for Labor. Obviously, the two-party preferred numbers are pretty spectacular too. Like north of 54% is a very good result to PP. It's really only bettered by our friends in the West who had a even more spectacular night. And I know you'll get into that in a separate podcast. I mean, it's interesting. I know we like a bit of Victorians like a bit of rivalry with New South Wales. The two-party preferred result for Labor in New South Wales, they had a good result too. It was only around 51.5%. So, just to demonstrate just how important Victoria is for Labor government. There is obviously, a concern that we saw a swing against Labor on our primary vote, and I think that's something that the party needs to unpack over time, drill into. I'm sure we can have a bit more of a conversation about that now. It did fall by 4%, which after Tassie was the biggest primary vote swing away from Labor in the country. So there's clearly something going on where people in Victoria moved away from Labor on the primary but came back to Labor on the 2PP. And in a preferential voting system, in the end, that's what matters the most because that result is translating into seats and the highest seat share of anywhere in the nation. So I think fundamentally great results, and also some really, I think, pleasing results for the campaigns that were run here in Victoria. I know we spoke on the night about the importance of the really positive campaigns that we saw in places like, in our target seats, places like Chisholm and in Higgins, the seats that we needed to win to form government. Resources, strategy, effort went into those. Chisholm had topped the list around the nation in terms of direct voter contact out of all of the seats around the country, according to the stats that the National Secretariat, Labor's National Secretariat, put together, and that saw a big primary vote swing of 4% towards Labor. Karina Garland did a great job there, and a two-party preferred swing of nearly 7%. I mean, that's a fantastic result in Chisholm. Higgins again, 2.5% swing to Labor on the primary vote, about just over 4% swing in two-party preferred terms. They are really solid results in terms of winning seats off the Liberal Party. And I think the other side to that is the seats that we held, and there's a lot of speculation going in to the campaign, particularly about Corangamite. The Prime Minister visited, I don't know how many times the Prime Minister visited Corangamite, but he was there an awful lot. In the end, we had a swing to us on the primary in Corangamite. Libby Coker did a fantastic job campaigning, and a two-party preferred swing to Labor in Corangamite of nearly 6.5%. So the 2PP swing in Corangamite and Chisholm were pretty much the same, and I think that just shows you how good the Labor campaigns were in two very different parts of Victoria. And also, we should mention that Dunkley as well, again, had a good result. Peter Murphy swing to her on the primary vote, and again, another solid 2PP swing of between 3 and 4%. So I think, really good signs for good local members in Libby and Peter winning, holding, and increasing their margins. So it's a really positive for the future.
It's one of the things I've taken from it because, as you said, we're going to talk a bit more about some of the, I guess, what we call deltas from the Victorian result in a moment. And I'm searching to get a sense of why we saw swings. I'm just talking purely on primary votes here. Why we saw swings against Labor in our held seats, both in the inner suburban parts of Melbourne and in the outer ring. But then there's a group of seats that we saw a swing to us on primary that were both either seats that we were going after in terms of wanting to gain from the Tories or seats that we currently held. And you've just mentioned them there, the two seats we needed to go after, Higgins and Chisholm, and the two seats we needed to hold, which we'd picked up in 2019, which was Corangamite and Dunkley. And a diversity of demographics there as well. Suburban, outer suburban Geelong, and then sort of into the regions in Corangamite, Dunkley, right down the bottom of the Mornington Peninsula, Frankston, then into sort of pretty wealthy areas of the state as well. And then obviously those Higgins, the one of the jewels in the crown of the Liberal Party for a long, long time. But then Chisholm, which is kind of I'd call that middle class eastern suburbs Melbourne, but also ethnically diverse as well. The thing that I took from it, the first thing I took from it, is we ran these were marginal seat campaigns. It had good candidates that worked. It had a field program. It had direct voter contact. There was mobilisation and organisation of volunteer capacity to go and have hard conversations on the doors with targeted either voters for whether they've been undecided or persuadable. And that's one of the strengths I think that we should take from this as a key learning is let's not forget the importance of the work of a field program and community organising and direct voter contact, actually talking to voters. And I want to sort of think about, we'll come back to this point later when we talk about the swings against us in some of these seats, but just to highlight that point that you just made, that we had swings to us on our primary because we spoke to voters on their doorsteps or on the telephone.
Absolutely. I think it is very clear that made a huge difference in those campaigns. And, the result, I think the result in Chisholm is particularly evidence of just how important that hard work was. The primary vote swing there of, a good percentage point higher than really any of the other seats in the eastern suburbs because it was just a massive effort. Now, those kind of efforts are very difficult to replicate across every electorate, and so the smart decision was made to put resources into the places that we needed to win us government, and that clearly, is the right approach when you're trying to form a government, not just trying to lift your vote. And they're always very important considerations too.
Another plus from the Victorian result was the swings that we saw to Labor then in other eastern suburban electorates that are held by the Tories. Deakin, which is a seat that Labor has held in the past, but Deakin, Aston, Menzies, significant swings to the point that they were on, they were too close to call on election night, and it took days for that count to sort of eventually sort of finalise. What do you draw from the results out there in the eastern suburbs?
Well, I think what you saw out in the eastern suburbs was really, you just saw how toxic Scott Morrison was. The negatives that Scott Morrison had and the Liberal Party had in those electorates were that people just in middle suburban Melbourne did not like Scott Morrison and did not want to vote for him. You had a Labor campaign at a candidate level and a national level that had a really smart strategy of saying, we can focus on things that matter to you in your lives. We have a program that is substantial but doesn't feel like it's going to overwhelm or have too much risk associated with it. It was a very smart policy strategy for the campaign and for the electoral offer, and that was spread out over not just the 5 or 6 weeks of this campaign, but it was a policy strategy that was actually built over the last couple of years. Things like the aged care focus, things like childcare, finding the space that climate became a positive for us and not a negative. I was involved in the lead up to the national conference in developing Labor's national platform. There were a lot of people who, learning the lessons from 2019, were, everyone would have liked the Labor platform to be bolder. But I think what the results in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne demonstrate is that a smart strategy can get people to come and vote for Labor, and ultimately that's what we need to be doing. And
just to sort of drive that home, obviously the broader swings to Labor in those seats that I just mentioned, 2PP were substantial. I think I'm just trying to look at this one here. What have we got? We've got Deakin was a two-party preferred swing of 4.5%, but on the primary it was like 0.4. Also wanted to illustrate that, where a ground game can make a difference. And I know that Matt Gregg, the Labor candidate out in Deakin, was doing some direct voter contact, but limited by the resources that were available to him to mobilise, volunteers, and I'm sure that a lot of those volunteers probably would have been piling into other neighbouring seats that were more targeted. But it just shows you that a field program can actually make a difference on that primary vote, and we can just see that there was a swing to Labor, at a 2PP level, but on a primary it was actually quite small.
I think that a couple of the other things that are worth mentioning. I mean, eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and I said this on election night. Let's watch what happens on the Belgrave-Lilydale line, and that was clearly for the Melbourne transport aficionados was an important piece of intelligence. But I think the other thing to look at, if you just look around the state, we got a 3% swing to us in Bendigo and Ballarat. I mean, great local members in Catherine King and Lisa Chesters have taken the Labor vote now in those two electorates on a two-party preferred basis into the mid-60s. And that's, they're significant results. They are now some of the bedrock of Labor's majority. And similarly, even down in Geelong, Richard Marles got a swing to him on a 2PP basis. So these kind of important regional centres where they've got their own, media markets, where they've got good locals doing good campaigning, show that they can really make a difference to our electoral results as well. And I don't think in focusing on the seats in Melbourne where we did well, I don't think we should neglect the kind of good work that has happened in some of the held seats, particularly those in regional Victoria, where we've picked up votes as well.
And not to take for granted, it's a really good point, Ryan, because we shouldn't take those seats for granted, because in 1990, sort of at the end of the Kern-Kaner state government, we lost all of those regional seats to the Liberals.
That's right.
And it took us a while to win them back. And over time, to your point.
I mean, there was a Liberal member for Ballarat before Catherine, and the Liberal Party's a very long way away from winning Ballarat because of the work that Catherine King's done over 20 years.
Yeah. Deltas from the election night. And I'm just trying to wonder how we can break this down, because upon studying the primary votes in Labor held seats, I noticed that there was a swing. Consistently, there was a swing, and it varied from size. So in some cases, it was as big as sort of 8-9% on primary to 4-3%. But in the inner city seats, there was a swing against Labor on its primary, and primarily a swing to the Greens or to left-leaning candidates. And then in the outer, so I'm talking Cooper, Wills, McNamara, Fraser, Maribyrnong. And then if you move into the outer fringes of Melbourne, both in the north, the west, and in the southeast, we saw swings against Labor on our primary, but to parties like Lib Dems, One Nation, and Palmer. How do you want to unpack that? What do you think?
I think I'll start at the macro level. So 3 out of every 4 polling booths in Victoria saw the major party vote go backwards. So whether they were Liberal national votes going backwards or Labor votes going backwards, of the vote, the numbers are slightly different because of the three-corner contest on the Conservative side. But basically, of around 900 to 2,000 polling places in the country, our vote went backwards in just under 1,500 of them, and the Liberals went backwards in about 1,600 of them, I think. And that's about 3 out of every 4. So across the board, there was a drop in the primary vote of the major parties. So we need to think about that in terms of what it means for major party politics, because that's clearly a shift that's on. There was an interesting stat that I saw that Ben Rowley from the Tally Room put on Twitter the other day, that the number of electorates decided on primary votes across the country in 2007 was 75. So half the electorates in the country in 2007 got decided on the primary vote. This election was 15, so 10%, which is a massive shift in terms of the role that votes for the major parties are playing in determining, at a very basic level, 50% plus one, who's won an electoral contest. So I think that's the first major learning, is that clearly there's an issue with primary votes for the major parties in Victoria. We saw it on the Liberal side, we saw it on the Labor side. And as you say, on the Labor side, I think we saw it in 2 distinct ways, although they might be related. One was that in certain parts of the city in particular, but again in some parts of the country, the rise in the primary vote of the Greens. So you saw, big increases in the Green vote in the Coopers and McNamaras, but also in Corangamite. There was, I think, a 5 or 6% increase in the Green vote in Corangamite. But it was interesting that the Green vote was static in Higgins. It didn't move in Higgins, and clearly that the change vote in Higgins came to Labor. It was pretty static in Maribyrnong, and as you say, in other parts of the metro area, places like Corwell, Gorton, Scullen, Lawler, Fraser, Bruce, Holt had a primary vote reduction of between kind of 7 and 10%, with Scullen being the outlier on 14, I think, because of the Liberal candidate last time was disendorsed. So there's probably a couple of percentage points in that there. But so between a 7 and 10% drop in the primary vote in those seats that you could, draw a ring around Melbourne. So there's clearly something going on there. And those votes went to, as you say, a sort of they sprayed in a lot of ways to a mix of Palmer, also United Australia Party, I should say, Hanson, bit of LDP, bit of local independent, so really all over the place. Largely they came back to Labor, so the 2PP swings were less than the primary vote losses, but it is something that we've got to look at. And I think part of it in both the Greens in the inner city in places like McNamara and Cooper, and in the outer suburbs to the Palmer, it's a protest vote that people were clearly disillusioned for a number of reasons with both of the major parties, and on different aspects of a policy offering, you saw simpler, different, and probably more expansive appeals, whether it was 3% fixed interest rates that Clive Palmer was putting in ads on every television station and every newspaper, or whether it was promises about ending mining and total public funding of dental care that the Greens were putting on the doorsteps of Cooper and McNamara. So I think they're partly elements of a similar issue. So I think that there's that, but there are differences in various places, and I think Labor does need to take a look at when all the data comes out. Both the National Office and the Victorian branch need to sit down and do a thorough look at our what happened to the primary vote, particularly in the north and the west and the southeast, because they're not. If these are trends, they're worrying trends. So we've got to figure out whether they're trends or whether it's something about 2022. Because I don't think you can explain what's happened in Victoria in the 2022 election without really thinking about what's happened in Victoria in 2020 and 2021. Like, this pandemic has done a lot of damage to the state. People have been affected in a lot of ways. And although the campaign wasn't about COVID and wasn't about the pandemic, you can't be human and not be affected by what's happened in the last couple of years and your experience in the last couple of years. So we've got to understand that as well and unpack that, because particularly in the northern suburbs and in the western suburbs, the degree of economic insecurity that we saw and the impact that it had on people's lives during the pandemic, rates of casualisation, multiple job holdings, people who had to go and keep working in essential service industries, whether it was in retail or transport and warehousing, or working in hospitals, right from orderlies and nurses and beyond. Those people have had a really rough couple of years because nothing's ever stopped for them, yet there's been a whole lot of other problems that have, in terms of access to services, access to healthcare, the worries all about all those vaccines, like all of these things pile up on people. And then we get to a campaign and inflation's running high at 5%, interest rates are going up, wages haven't been going up. So people who are feeling the pressures of economic insecurity because of job insecurity, casualisation, potentially unable to access the housing market because of rising housing costs. Everything they buy is becoming more and more expensive: petrol, power, food, and they haven't had a pay rise in many years. Like, all of these things are what's been going on in the lives of people living right across the suburbs of Melbourne, and we can't explain this result without understanding those issues and figuring out what we've got to do about them as a government in particular. Because I think what also we saw in the campaign was that with that kind of a issues melting pot, if you like, you saw the bombardment of the airwaves and the pages of the newspaper, online advertising with relentless advertising particularly from the UAP, Clive Palmer, who spent millions and millions of dollars telling people that the major parties were basically the same. If you look at his ads, it was a picture of Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison shaking hands in the Parliament. He was saying basically a pox on both your houses, and I'm going to keep interest rates at 3%, or I'm going to make it easier for you to get into the housing market, or I'm going to bring super home. So there's I think there's a very clear case that the vulnerabilities on economic insecurity met an advertising campaign focused on those issues that told people that the major parties weren't on their side, and that's a significant part of what we've seen in these election results.
And if I can sort of bring my campaign hat into it, for all of the money that the UAP spent in advertising that message, only 4 or 5% of the electorate in those communities went, "Oh, that's a good idea. You know, I'm about that." As a return on investment, you know, if you and I were the branch secretaries and did that, people would, you know, would be out of a job. You know,
it was a huge amount of money that for the second election in a row has been spent on those kind of messages, and it's had an effect. But as you say, it's probably in the 4 to 5 for the UAP, a couple of other percent around the place. I mean, and unlike what we saw with the Teals, they were very geographically focused on certain parts in certain electorates. I mean, basically in Melbourne, it was Goldstein and Kooyong that had all of their focus and effort and a community organising model that backed it up. Whereas what you saw on the flip side with Palmer was kind of a spraying of a mass message with not much that sat underneath it in terms of a community organising model to convert that discontent into votes for their people. I think that's also an interesting part, to get back to your point about what role does campaigning and local campaigns have in converting discontent to votes. You saw a well-organised community-run machine knock off Josh Frydenberg and Tim Wilson, whereas an equally receptive audience in the north and the west just wasn't able to mount that kind of same organising model.
I've got a question for you in that, and I want to talk about SAFE. I guess the campaign contract that we have with Labor MPs when they get pre-selected for us, what we'd normally call a safe Labor seat. I always make the joke that when you do get pre-selected for that seat, you've won Tassalotto because you've basically got a job for life. And the contract, sort of the unspoken contract, is you've got this great piece of real estate and it's yours for as long as you work it. In return, we would like to think that you're capable enough to be on the front bench of a future Labor government. If not, at least be a great local member. You are not going to get centralised funding to support your campaign because we have to allocate. Resources are finite. And we have to allocate it to the marginal seats. But we still expect you, with the plethora of resources that you've got, you should be able to maintain your margins there. I'm now starting to think to your point there about this sort of air war that was being bombarded into these particular communities in the north and the west and the southeast, and also, like, if you look at the booth results in Moe. The seat of Monash is not a Labor seat by any stretch of imagination. The old McMillan seat was Christian Zara's. But the booths in Moe have always been historically strong Labor booths for us. And they swung same kind of numbers, 9, 10, 11, 12% against Labor to Palmer and to One Nation. So I think that we need to sort of sit down with our local MPs now and say, look, you're just going to have to work as hard as someone in a target seat and I don't say that in a disrespectful way. I'm not implying that they're not working hard, but I know that they're not knocking on doors. I mean, there are some exceptions to the rule, and I'm going to call out some names here, and I'm not doing that at the exclusion of others. But I know for a fact, like at a state level, Nat Hutchins gets out there and knocks on doors, and she's mobilising a lot of her volunteer base to do that. Sarah Connolly is working her electorate as well. And like I said, I'm not saying there's a whole bunch of others that are not. But the expectation now, I think, on those folks that are in reasonably safe Labor seats going forward is you're going to have to get in the trenches, and you're going to have to find supporters, organise them, and then mobilise them to go and have those conversations with folks on the doors. I think things have to change a bit in those seats. What's your thoughts on that?
I think we do, and it's got to be the connection of the party to the community over the course of a term. This is not an issue that emerges for 6 weeks every 3 or 4 years. So this is about members and their teams, campaign teams, office teams, connecting with their local community groups, doing all that work that builds trust in areas. And we've seen, I mean, one of the things I was sort of had a look at was like, I thought, is this a new phenomenon? Probably no. Well, let's go back and have a look at what some of this has happened in the past. So, a few by-election results just to sort of give you a flavour of Labor's, an assault on Labor's primary vote in past, at a state election, in state elections. So, working backwards, Altona in 2010, when Jill Hennessy came in, she suffered a 13% swing away from her on the primary vote at that by-election, was built back up again. In Coleroy in 2008, a 13% primary vote swing against Labor. So the primary vote went from around just under 50%, 48.5% in the by-election to back to the mid-60s by the mid-2000s. So, time building, local members building it up. And if you look at the North, moment that was probably close to the hearts of people close to me, that the Thomastown by-election in 1990 was a 24% primary vote swing away from Labor. And again, that was built back up over time. So we have seen some of these types of vote swings in these areas away from Labor in the past. I think we can't expect that they'll be isolated now and into the future. And it does require us to think about what the operating model for ongoing community engagement is. And I think, what's the policy? What's the government offer? What's government? If the purpose of voting Labor is to change the government so that government changes your life for the better, how is that going to happen for these communities? What is the improvements to the social infrastructure that we're going to see across the North and the West and the Southeast? What is the improvements in job security that we're going to deliver in policy terms? How are we going to make sure that government's delivering? Because we've seen that when they do, these communities clearly come back and vote Labor again strongly.
To that point as well, to the first point about the sort of, I almost see it like a boom bust kind of primary vote cycle over the course of elections. Like, I don't want to go so far back, like, 18 Diggity 4 or whatever, but, 1998, the GST election, you look at a lot of those booths in the outer ring of Melbourne, huge swings to Labor's primary. But then the Tampa Bay election 3 years later, in 2001, our swings against us on our primary. 07, the Kevin 07 campaign, once again, big swings back to Labor on our primary, like huge swing, like substantial movement, right? And then 2013 swings against us again. And then 16 kind of corrects it again, comes back out again, and now we've seen another swing against us. Now there is a trend there. To one of your earlier points about seeing trends, there is a trend where we're seeing this sort of this boom and bust cycle on our primary in our heartland. We don't want to then have another election in 3 years' time and see it swing again against us. Then we're going, oh, okay, that's okay. Well, now we're starting to see a pattern that's not great. But I actually want to offer some word of caution about what we are seeing, and let's not start jumping off the Westgate Bridge just quite yet.
Well, just on that point, and we have to also remember that Bernie Finn was the member for Tullamarine for 2 terms.
Yeah.
In the lower house, out in the north and the west.
Genghis Khan himself.
That's right.
Insane. And then to the point about policy, When there is a change election, you do tend to see, like, if the electorate's kind of made up their mind and they're going to kick out the old team and I want a new team come in, like 07, like 13. I thought that this was a change election, and it was. We changed government, but it was interesting to see in the lead up to election day with the research showing that the Labor primary was staying low, and we weren't seeing this sort of late break of those being polled who were indicating that they were other, and they stuck with that in their primary vote. And I guess it's to that point before you were saying about, the insecurities of people out in those outer suburbs, but also in the inner city as well, because a lot of people voted for the Greens. What's going on there? What do you think happened there? What are the influencing factors that said, you know what, I'm going to give my second preference or third preference to Labor over the Tories because I'm not voting for them. That guy's got to go. But I'm not going to give. There was basically roughly 20% of the electorate that said, well, I'm not giving my first preference to Labor. Whereas normally in 07, 2013 for the Tories, people did do that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think partly it's got to do with, if we take the comparison back to 2007, like why did a whole lot of people vote Labor in 2007 for change, but a lot of them decided, this section of the community that decided not to vote Labor first, but vote Labor second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever it was, just ahead of the Liberals. People do forget that a big part of 2007 was work choices, that the importance that voting Labor to get rid of something that was, in a policy sense, undermining your job security, making it easy to get sacked and lowering your wages. That was, it was a pretty brutal message about the impact that work choices had on people who you would say fall into those categories of being more vulnerable in those types in that type of work, have less negotiating power, all of those sorts of things. When the scales were tilted more in favour of the bosses. So I think that's part of it, and there was no issue like that in this election. That the policy agenda that we were fighting on was not one of sharp ideological division in a Labor capital sense in the way that it was back in 2007. So I think that's definitely had an impact. I think part of this and part of the strategy in this election was clearly from Labor that the way to win there was sort of two choices, I suppose. There was to bank that a whole lot of people didn't want to vote for Scott Morrison, but some of them wanted, a highly ambitious change agenda. And we saw that ground really being taken by the Teal candidates and to a degree by the Greens, and that they wanted, a more ambitious policy agenda from Labor. And I think the Labor campaign had to make a decision as to whether they chased those voters or whether they chased the other cohort of voters who didn't like the Liberal Party, didn't like Scott Morrison, but weren't 100% convinced that Labor was the place to go, who wanted essentially safe change, who wanted change that wasn't going to totally revolutionise their lives, who wasn't going to bring in, a whole lot of new taxes, scare them with a whole lot of big agendas that had been rejected by the voters in the past. And so Labor, I think, had to make the strategic decision to focus its efforts on those voters who might not have voted for us if we didn't have the kind of election strategy that we did have and the kind of election program that we did have this time compared to people that we know that didn't vote for us in 2019. And I think that we saw the effect of that in this campaign, that we said to a lot of people, we will be the change that you want to see, we'll be safe, we'll deliver the sort of things that are important to you, we'll get on and do them, but, we're not going to... what you see in Anthony Albanese is not this massive transformative program that runs to, 1 million pages thick, because people clearly got worried by that in 2019. We learned those lessons and we had a different approach. I think the consequence of that was that there were another section of people who probably wanted us to do more and wanted us to be more ambitious. And I think you probably saw a little bit of that in what happened in McNamara, where Josh Burns had a slight increase in his primary vote. Like Josh did well on his primary. It's just that a whole lot of Liberals, a lot of people were dissatisfied with the Liberal Party, and a lot of them went, well, there was a big rise in the Green vote. And that's probably to do with the kind of scale of ambition. And it's probably what played out a little bit in Queensland as well, where the scale of ambition that people wanted to see was ahead of where the Labor campaign was, because the Labor campaign had made a strategic decision that it wanted to do what was going to maximise its chance of winning. And that's the trade-off there.
It really had a sense of 2019 was like you're playing. If I can use a Celtic parlance here, you're playing at home in a European night, and you're playing with 4 up front, and you absolutely just go on the tonk. This campaign felt like an away game in Europe, where you're parking the bus and you're just you want to get a result, but you're just going to be cautious and just try and etch it out. And it felt like that. It felt like we threaded the needle. I mean, we did. We formed government, and ultimately that's what we had to do. No one's going to look back in 30 years' time and say, oh, yeah, but they didn't really. It wasn't a sexy campaign, or didn't light it up, and we win by 40 seats or whatever. In the end, people only remember who was in government and what they did.
Well, people are going to remember judge the Labor government on the next 3 years, not the last 6 weeks. And the next election will be fought on the record of this government as a government, and whether they do what they say they do, and that's really important, whether they take a sensible approach to the challenges and effectively deal with the multitude of challenges that are ahead of us, and that they find reasons to make people feel happy about having voted Labor or happy to vote Labor again. I mean, I think part of the challenge that we've got in this next election, just to get onto the future for a moment at a federal level, is to convince the people who voted for the government last time to vote for the government next time, because they voted Liberal 2 weeks ago, and we need them to vote Labor next time, and they are probably more cautious again. But we also need to provide the people who want more ambition, who want a government that has a vision for the future of Australia that they are really excited about, probably that's also speaking more to younger voters as well. I mean, there are a lot of new voters that came onto the roll. How do we make sure that they get excited by Labor's agenda and the transformative nature of a Labor government that we know that Labor governments can be and will be? How do we make sure there's enough in the agenda for them as well? And I think we're seeing steps in the right direction. I mean, the focus that Anthony has put on implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart and putting a voice to the Parliament for First Nations people into the Constitution, it was the first thing he said on stage on his election night victory speech. And I think if we can harness those types of moods to build enthusiasm for the way that Labor will govern, I think we can do a lot to convince those people that maybe they would have liked more from us last time, but we're actually delivering what they want when we're there.
In our sort of final analysis, key takeaways for us from the result in Victoria, starting with what does the Andrews government draw from this? They've got a really important poll in November this year, and looking to make another historic win, take them into their 3rd term in office. So I think a lot of people out there probably just think it's a given. I'm not of that view. I think that every elections you need to play it as if you're going to lose. What are some of the key takeaways that you have from the result on the 21st of May that we should consider for the Andrews government election?
I mean, I think we've got to obviously draw the distinction between state and federal, but the mood, clearly there was a mood in Melbourne in particular that is a bit angry, frustrated over the last couple of years. So figuring out how we process the pandemic effects on the voting population will be important in November. And it's people don't want to talk about it all the time, so I understand that. But we need to think about those issues. Clearly, cost of living pressures are really hurting people. Like, it's power prices going up, petrol prices going up, job security. Those are really big issues that need to be front and centre of where the Andrews government and what it can do vis-a-vis those questions. And I think the other thing that probably on the other side is that, I mean, we shouldn't underplay the importance that integrity issues played in the federal campaign, and so they will, you can certainly see where the Liberal Party at a state level is trying to draw some parallels. I think they're vastly different here, but those sort of we've just got to watch that. But those kind of issues as they bubble along, I think they're important issues. I think the big difference though between the Morrison government and the Andrews government is you've got a track record of actually doing things. I mean, it does sound a bit trite to say this is a government that's delivered, but it has. It has changed the shape and face of the suburbs of Melbourne in many ways. It's done a lot in the regions. I think we can't just think that'll be enough, but it's an important ingredient in success is actually demonstrating that you're electing a government that can actually make a difference to your lives rather than promising you that they will and they're not actually doing anything, because people get sick of that. I think that's sort of another important part of that lesson. And then figuring out what the next set of challenges that the state's facing are and how we're going to deal with it. I think there are going to be. I mean, clearly the state budget was framed around health for a very, very good reason. That's clearly an issue out there in the community. It certainly came across clearly in the parts of the federal campaign, the concerns that people had about access to healthcare and figuring out how the state government deals with that, works with the new federal government to deliver on that, I think are important as well.
One of the things I found interesting from a lot of the analysis, and I'm completely ignoring some of the craziest stuff that was like the front page of the Herald Sun a couple of days ago, but more so to your point about the things that the Andrews government have to be cognizant of going into this poll in November. And I guess it's not just, I think one of the strengths of the 2018 campaign was we could point to things that, and this came up in a lot of our research, we can point to the things that Labor had done that we said we would do in 2014. And then that gave us permission to say, and these are the things that we're promising in the next term. And people go, oh, that makes sense. And I think that recipe could be replicated again. So they need to come up with, where does the government continue to go to invest in communities to make their lives a lot better and, deal with all the things that you just mentioned, cost of living and whatnot, health and et cetera. The thing I find difficult for what the Liberals do is that their party's been gutted in Victoria. If you look at the results in the eastern suburbs, there's a whole bunch of state Liberal MPs that should be shitting themselves about whether or not they're going to get re-elected. There isn't any evidence actually of the Liberal Party picking up seats in the western suburbs. There's evidence that will be swings against the Labor Party on their primary, and maybe you might find one or two examples of an independent or something maybe jagging a seat as a sort of a collective non-Labor ticket. But there is specific evidence of swings to the Labor Party against the Liberal vote in the eastern suburbs. Now, you're trying to draw a pathway back to 45 seats in the Victorian lower house. You need to take some seats off of us in the regions, and we've already talked about how Labor's doing quite well there. You need to take some seats off us down the Sandbelt, and those, at this stage anyway, these seats look reasonably comfortable. Meanwhile, you've got to defend your heartland in the eastern suburbs, which has been under threat from either Labor or this sort of insurgency within your own sort of centre-right grouping of the Teals. I mean, what's the lessons for the Tories here? I mean, can we?
Well, they're in a lot. I mean, you're right. They're in a lot of strife. I mean, they're fighting on fronts that they don't want to be fighting on when they should be. I mean, they're playing they're going to need to play a defensive game in those electorates where they when there is now a ready-made set of community organisers who want a certain type of Liberal Party that, frankly, they haven't seen in a very long time. The kind of Liberals that supported Monique Ryan and Zoe Daniel aren't the kind of Liberals that really are appealed to by the way that the State Liberal Party has gone about doing its politics in recent years. And they're not going to be convinced, I think, by more of the same. So there is really, I think, going to be a defensive posture for the Liberals in terms of their seat strategy in November and their policy agenda. I think they're going to be betwixt and between about what they do, because they're not going to know what the right approach is. That's going to definitely cause them a whole lot of troubles. Where do they think the big issues that they need to be fighting on are? I'm not sure that they know that now. And more importantly, how are they going to convince the electorate that they're better placed than the current government to deliver on them? Like, does anyone really think that they're going to be best placed to get the hospitals back on track again? I mean, I think there's on the performance of the last few years, does anyone really think that they're going to actually be better at fixing the local infrastructure and congestion issues that exist across suburbs? So I do fear that they might pick some issues where they don't necessarily have the greatest answer about what they do and have a credibility gap about whether they can deliver. All of that being said, I think it's going to be, I agree with your sentiment. I think it's going to be a tight election. It's going to be a close election. I'm here because of that phenomenon that we saw writ large across Victoria, which is a decline in the major party primary vote. And I think we'll see that again. I think the other challenge, the other big difference I think that people have got to think through is that you can't see a Palmer propaganda machine roll out at a Victorian state election in the same way they did at a federal election, nor a Climate 200 intervention in the same way, because of the changes that have been made to political donation laws in Victoria, which, fundamentally, if you want to talk about, what matters to bring integrity into politics, more public funding and less reliance on mega donations from billionaires probably would be top of everyone's list. And the Victorian election will be one where there are limits on donations, there's rules about spending, which mean that we won't see a repeat of the kinds of cash that flowed into either Clive Palmer or, frankly, the Teal campaigns in the federal election in Victoria, which means that, Labor is vulnerable, Liberals are vulnerable to well-organised community independence, wherever they may be, whether it's in the western suburbs or the eastern suburbs or the southeastern suburbs. But they take a lot of effort to get off the ground, and with effort and enthusiasm, they could definitely be there and be a threat, and we should absolutely think that they are. But money won't play the same role in our election that it did in May.
Well, it'll be fascinating to watch. As we sort of come off the glow of this amazing victory on the 21st of May, we start to now turn our attention, certainly here in Victoria, to the last Saturday in November, which is such a critical election for us all, and we want to make sure that we can re-elect the Andrews government. So I'm sure, Ryan, we'll have you back on the show at some stage to talk more about that. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast today, and thank you for joining us on election night for our live telecast, and also thank you to McKell for being one of our co-sponsors as well to get that live telecast off the ground in the space of 3 days. I'm not still sure how we did it, but we did it nonetheless. I don't know if we landed it, but people watched it, so that's a good start.
Well, I think it was, I think one of the reasons why we wanted to support it was because it's so important to get more voices out there in politics, in the public debate, that the kind of, lessons from the way that people are consuming news about politics and information about politics in today's world is that they do take more out of podcasts, or they do take more out of different information sources, and it's important that the progressive side of politics has lots of those voices as well as as the more reactionary side does.
And they've got plenty of them.
They sure do.
Ryan Batchelor, thank you very much for coming on the show again.
Thanks, Stephen.
And look forward to talking to you soon. Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.